I had imagined that holiday for months before it finally arrived. I remember sitting at my desk on cold winter evenings, scrolling through photographs of beaches, forests, and old temples, thinking that a change of scenery would clear my head after a difficult year. The itinerary promised quiet mornings, local wildlife, and small hotels scattered along the coast. And I counted down the days until departure with the kind of excitement that makes time feel slower. The irony is that when the trip finally began, I barely noticed the scenery outside my airplane window, because my body was trying to tell me something was wrong. At first it felt like the usual discomfort that comes with long flights. I blamed the food, shifted in my seat, drank more water, and assumed it would pass. Instead, a deep ache settled into my lower back and spread until every movement reminded me it was there. By the time we landed, I was forcing smiles through clenched teeth, hoping nobody would notice how miserable I felt. A doctor was called to examine me after I reached the hotel, and after a brief conversation and a few tests, he explained that I had a serious infection and needed medication and rest. His advice was simple: stay put, recover, and avoid unnecessary activity. It was Christmas Day, and instead of exploring a place I had dreamed about visiting, I spent most of it lying in a dark room, listening to waves crash outside, while distant laughter drifted in through the windows. Families walked along the beach, children shouted as they played in the surf, and somewhere music was being performed for holiday guests. But I remained under a blanket, staring at the ceiling and wondering how quickly I could get back on my feet. The next morning, a note arrived, explaining that because of my condition, I could remain behind while the rest of the tour continued. The staff were kind, reassuring me that I would be more comfortable staying where medical attention was available. But the thought of spending days alone while everyone else traveled felt unbearable. I had not flown across the world to watch opportunities disappear from my bed. So I packed my medication, thanked everyone for their concern, convinced myself I felt stronger than I really did, and climbed aboard the vehicle with the group. Nothing about that decision felt extraordinary at the time. It seemed like the ordinary stubbornness many travelers have when they refuse to let inconvenience ruin carefully made plans. We drove inland, admired unfamiliar landscapes, and chatted casually about where we had come from and what we hoped to see next. I remember thinking more about whether my back would stop hurting than about anything else. The following day, we stopped somewhere with a television showing international news. The images were confusing because the audio was in another language, but I could clearly see flooded streets, damaged buildings, frightened people running through water, and helicopters overhead. Someone nearby mentioned the word tsunami, though at first it seemed distant, like one more tragic story happening somewhere else in the world. Our guide believed the worst of it involved another country, so we continued with the day's schedule, while bits of information slowly filtered in through scattered phone calls and text messages received by the few people carrying mobile phones. The mood changed almost invisibly. One traveler looked pale after reading a message from home. Another quietly stepped aside to make a call. The conversations became shorter and more serious. Then, I borrowed a phone and reached someone back home who answered in tears before I had the chance to say hello. The relief in that voice confused me until the explanation finally came. News reports had identified the coastal area where we had been staying, and because communication had broken down, many assumed anyone there had been caught in the disaster. Friends and relatives believed I was missing, perhaps even dead. I sat there trying to process those words while replaying the previous morning in my mind. The hotel we had left behind, the beach outside my room, the path I had walked while feeling too sick to enjoy it. All of it had been overtaken by floodwaters after we departed. There was no cinematic flash before my eyes or dramatic collapse to my knees. Instead, there was a strange silence inside me, as if my thoughts had stopped moving, while trying to understand how a completely ordinary decision could separate two entirely different futures. Eventually, our families confirmed that we were safe, and the panic eased, but the atmosphere for the rest of the trip never returned to what it had been. At our request, we visited an affected area once conditions allowed. The distance between where we stood and where we had slept only days before was shockingly small. Broken buildings, overturned objects, and exhausted volunteers replaced the postcard scenes I had imagined before leaving home. The air carried an unfamiliar heaviness that made everyone speak more softly than usual. None of us could fix what had happened, yet we found small ways to help. Carrying supplies, assisting where we were directed, and doing simple tasks that seemed insignificant against such overwhelming destruction, but still felt worthwhile. I remember watching strangers comfort one another despite sharing no common language, and realizing that compassion often arrives before words do. When I finally returned home, I expected life to continue as if nothing unusual had happened. Instead, my inbox filled with messages from people I had not heard from in years. Old classmates, distant relatives, former co-workers, neighbors from previous apartments, and acquaintances I barely remembered all reached out to say they had been worried. Some admitted they had watched constant news coverage, hoping to see updated lists of survivors. Others confessed they had already begun imagining how they would explain my disappearance to mutual friends. Reading those messages late at night affected me more deeply than the disaster itself. I had gone through daily life, assuming most people barely noticed whether I was around. Yet there was unmistakable evidence that my absence would have mattered. That realization stayed with me long after the headlines faded. I did not wake up the next morning transformed into a different person. Nor did I suddenly abandon my old life in pursuit of dramatic change. The shift happened slowly, through dozens of ordinary choices. I found myself becoming less interested in winning pointless arguments or stressing over delays that would not matter a week later. I called family members without waiting for special occasions. I accepted invitations I would once have declined because I was too busy or too tired. I became curious about helping other people in practical ways instead of always assuming someone else would step in. Over the following years, that curiosity carried me farther than I expected. I spent extended periods volunteering, meeting communities I would never have encountered otherwise, and assisting wherever extra hands were useful. At one stage, I was invited to stay in a monastery, where part of my time involved supporting students with visual impairments. The work itself was not glamorous. Many days consisted of routine tasks, repeated over and over. Yet those routines left me feeling more grounded than many accomplishments that had once seemed impressive. Occasionally people asked whether surviving that trip had given me some profound secret about life. But I never knew how to answer, because the biggest lessons arrived quietly rather than dramatically. Looking back now, what strikes me most is not the enormous wave shown on television, or the terrifying possibility of what might have happened. It is the smaller chain of events that came before it. The illness I resented, the pain that interrupted my plans, the doctor telling me to rest, the medication I reluctantly packed, the decision to continue the journey despite feeling miserable. At the time, every one of those moments looked like an inconvenience standing between me and the vacation I wanted. Only later did I recognize that what appears to block our path may sometimes be quietly guiding it instead. I no longer rush to label every disruption as bad luck, because experience has taught me that the full story often reveals itself much later. I still think about that trip whenever unexpected setbacks appear in my own life. I think about lying in that dark room, wishing my body would cooperate, unaware that events far beyond my understanding were already unfolding. I think about the phone call filled with tears of relief, and the realization that people had imagined a world in which I never came home. Most of all, I think about the years that followed, the conversations I would have missed, the friendships that deepened, the opportunities to help strangers, and the quiet mornings that seemed ordinary until I understood how easily they might never have existed. The experience did not convince me that everything happens for a reason, nor did it erase fear or uncertainty from my life. But it left me with a lasting awareness that our plans are only one version of the future, and that interruptions sometimes carry invisible possibilities of their own. Whenever I am tempted to resent an unexpected delay, or curse a change I never wanted, I remember the journey that began with sickness, confusion, and disappointment. Because what first looked like the worst possible start ended up becoming the reason I was still around to discover everything that came after.